The ABAP development strategy and scope. In this video, you will learn about how to define the right ABAP development scope and strategy for your project, as well as how to effectively manage your development teams. So the video is divided into the following topics: ABAP development strategy, ABAP development process, ABAP development estimate and planning, and ABAP development controlling. So before we move on, let's just clarify, if anyone is in doubt, that ABAP is the coding language in SAP. And when we talk about ABAP development, we talk about the RISE F scope, which was reports, conversion, enhancement, interfaces, and forms. So this is the different types of developments, and it's all being coded in the ABAP development language. Okay, let's move on and have a look at the ABAP development strategy. So a good ABAP development strategy, we need to have certain consideration that we need to look at. So first of all, are there any development constraints? That can be maximum number of man days that is available, schedule available, or any constraint in the development types. For instance, is there certain enhancements that we will not be able to do, or interfaces, because we don't have the team to do the development of the legacy side of the interface? Is there certain forms that we don't do? What is our policy of developing? Are there any, do our schedule only allow a certain number of man days available? That means we need to, when we build the team, we need to keep that as a constant, and we need to scale up and down the team members. And again, man day schedule is linked. So it can be other constraints as well. Do we only have a physical location or certain licenses or whatever it might be? But we need to, when we start our strategy development work or developing our strategy, we need to look at any constraints that will impact our development. Then we need to validate the development scope and the estimate. So during the business blueprint, the functional team would have recommended a number of development needed in order to supplement the SAP standard process. Those developments has been signed off, and during the business blueprint sign-off process, and as part of that sign-off, the functional team must do a high-level estimate of the effort. Now, they can't do that estimate effort without involving the ABAP. So that's why when you're staffing your team, you need to have ABAP support during the last part of your business blueprint design phase, even though that no ABAP development work will actually be started. But you need to have the ABAP developer skills or an architect there, so to support the functional team in estimating what developments can be done. Is it functional? Is it technical possible to do that development? Is there a user exit in SAP, as it's called, that will allow you to do that development without breaking the good practice of not modifying the SAP code, but using certain documented user exits, which will allow you to add your own custom code in a supported manner? So are those available? Is it technical feasible and possible to do the development? And how much effort is estimated that each of these development will take? Now, the functional team will be very focused on the business requirement, and even though that you already have set direction when you initiated the project that you are going to use the standard SAP as much as possible, you need to make sure that you do a validation. Are all the developments truly required and recommended? So it might be that it's desired and it's signed off that we need this for the design, but is it truly recommended? And if you have a constraint in number one, you might need to look at cutting down the development scope. It might not be technical possible to do before you go live or before certain key activities, and you might need to look at, am I going to do it, or am I going to do it in a phased approach? So there needs to be a validation exercise of your development scope and estimate. That said, you'll also need to look at who will actually do your development. Is it an external vendor? And it's highlighted here because then you need to get moving on the vendor selection process. Or is it an internal development team that you already have access to? So I've seen project gets in a lot of trouble which they will never recover from if they cut this very close, meaning we get the design signed off, and when the functional team starts on the specs, the development specification and the configuration, you start sourcing the external development vendor selection process, and you don't get that finalized, so you have a competent development team established that can actually be part of that specification documentation process, and then understand what they're going to build. So when they come to your project, they get a cold start, so to speak, and they need to start from scratch, studying what is your whole project about, and that will take time where they were supposed to, at this stage of your project, actually already be doing the technical developments. So make this decision up front, perhaps do a pre-selection of certain vendors. We'll get to the vendor selection later, but do a pre-selection perhaps, or at least do some consideration and a strategy for how am I going to handle the execution of my development after I got it finalized and signed off in the business blueprint confirmation workshop. You also need to make sure you have QA processes established, and it doesn't matter if it's an internal or an external vendor, you need to have a QA process. I've seen projects fail on this as well, or get in a lot of trouble where we have bug after bug after bug, and it simply kills every possibility you have to do a realistic scheduling, because if the bugs keep happening, you cannot estimate the unknown. So it's a risk, and it's impacting the project, and I've seen go live dates being postponed again and again and again because there is no proper QA process. And it sometimes follows if you try to have the development done by non-skilled teams that don't have the necessary support from development architects, senior people, but you have a bunch of developers led by an inexperienced architect or a senior developer, and there's really not proper control and QA. So make sure you have service level agreement if it's external vendors. Even if it is internal vendors, you can have a service level agreement. Make sure you have QA review in there. You need to have a culture where bugs are not acceptable. That needs to be your culture, and it needs to be stressed when you do your kickoff workshop for the development work. Also, you need to look at, depending on the scope of course, but do you need any specific tools to support your development work, such as documentation, modeling tools, test tools, whatever it might be. If such is needed, or your vendor expect you to, the external vendor expect you to have these tools in place, you need, as part of the proof of concept and establishing the project infrastructure, which we covered in course 1, you need to make sure that you have the development tools part of that tool strategy, and you have it in place well ahead of when you need it. So this is of course easier said than done, but knowing these pitfalls is the first step in avoiding them. So let's try and have a look at the ABAP development process. So on the right side here, I have taken from the ASAP method the work breakdown structure of the task that is needed according to them. So I'll simplify this and walk you through the steps. So we start by an ABAP estimate. This is coming from the business blueprint. This is what the business blueprint have been signed off based on. And as we said on the previous slide, you need to make sure that it's validated. Once it's validated, now starts the development process. You have what is recommended, what is confirmed to go into development. So the first step of this process is your functional specifications. This is where the functional team, supported by the developer, the technical developer and the architects, sit down and document what is the specification and the requirements to each of the items in the RISE-F development scope. And the deliverables from this is the functional specification documents. And here is some common used abbreviations. So IDD, interface design definition, EDD, enhancement design definition, report, forms, and the only one that's missing here is the C, conversion design definitions. Then you have the RISE-F. So you have a naming standard, and again, we've been through already the naming standards for your project. Make sure you also apply that to the different functional and technical documents that needs to be produced. So this is the output from the functional specification step. Then you go into the technical specification. This is where the developer, based on the functional specification, converts that into a technical specification. This is basically saying, how am I going to construct the program? And the deliverables are the technical specification document, following a similar naming standard as the functional ones. Then he goes into the actual development, and here those two steps is often interlinked. So you do some initial design work on the technical side here, and then you go into and you develop it, and after you've developed it is where you refine and finalize the technical design documents. That's fine as long as you have a control and as long as you have a senior developer, preferably an architect, coordinator, that development manager, who can make sure that this happens. Otherwise, the technical team might get sidetracked into making the program but forgetting all about any good practice in terms of the developing and the documentation. And you need to make sure that before they start coding here, no matter if these two steps are interlinked or not, you need to have the standard in place. You need to agree on, based on your scope. Once you know what items you need to develop, you need to sit down and you need to define the boundaries where the development will happen within. Naming standards, variables, structure, certain common across all the development, common ways that I want you to specify the different program routines, whatever, in this way. So you need to have, once you sit down before you start developing, and now that you know the scope, you need to sit down and establish that common framework for your development. Then you go into unit test, and this is the developer who's doing the unit testing of the development. And then once that's passed, we have a test script, which is the deliverable from the unit test, and we have a test result. So it should actually say a test result. This is the developer making that and testing it, and then it goes on to the functional people. So the yellow here is the functional teams, and the functional people will then go in and do the testing to make sure that the functional specification fits with what they got. If not, it will go back to the development team as a problem report, and it will go through again. A lot of graphics here, but I hope you get the process flow. So this is very straightforward, but it needs to be controlled. Otherwise, you can sit waiting for development, and when you get it, it doesn't work, or it's completely not, or it's completely do not hit, how to say, it doesn't match the requirements, and you don't really want that situation, because depending on what it is, you could have, this process can take days, hours, weeks. So you need to be in control. Okay, and that, sorry, was the last deliverable here, test reports, test scripts. So this is the final verification that everyone is happy of the development meets the functional scope, and these deliverables will then be the input for the next phase. So before we look at the controlling, let's have a look at the development estimating and planning. So few good advice here. Establishing a development team takes time. So when you plan this, as I already mentioned a little bit, don't expect that once you have your blueprint signed off, which in most cases I've seen will be a challenge and might be slightly delayed or signed off with conditions that needs to be worked on. So don't expect that once you have the blueprint signed off, you can go straight into development if it's an external vendor, unless you have sourced that vendor in beforehand. And depending on what the contract with the vendor is, how will you know the scope until the blueprint is signed off? So what comes first, the chicken or the egg? So just be aware that establishing a development team takes time, and even if it might even take time if it's internal developers, because you might need to get them released, you might need them to know certain new ABAP language or know the details about your project. So establishing a development team takes time. Secondly, ensure a QA review of your estimates or validation. And you need to communicate the QA criteria and the service level agreements for those estimates. So this is the normal matrix that I've used on a number of projects. So you have, this is for enhancements, the E in the RISE-F abbreviation. So you categorize it into high, medium, low complexity. Functional team supported by development teams do that. You have a total of it, and of course there is detail for each and every one of these 13. You break it down in this sheet. You estimate each of them, you roll it up, both for the functional effort, the development effort, and you have a total man days. And does that meet your constraint? If not, you might need to reduce the development scope, you might need to add more people. So this is the planning of it. So you need that detailed tracking. And you need to communicate what is the acceptance criteria here, especially if you have an external vendor that will receive this estimate as part of the blueprint output, and based on that might need to give you a fixed price contract. It's very important that they know what are the QA criteria that this estimate has to fulfill. So does this mean that it's tested and there's no more bugs? Or does it mean that we just deliver the first version for testing? So you need the QA, the criteria and service level for your development. You need to set that, you need to do a QA of it, and you need to communicate it to your team as well as any vendors. Do not take shortcuts on the testing. Inadequate testing results in bugs. You need to put in a culture where the box is not accepted, but still the easiest place to cut if you are behind schedule is on the testing. But it will also means that you might get a bug, and that bug to fix it, go back and do the entire development process through again, deliver it to the functional teams depending on where the bugs has been found, will in most cases be much more costly in time and effort than it would be if you ensure you have proper testing done. As mentioned, no bugs are not accepted, but make sure that you filter out them through the testing and don't rely on this. So talking about bugs, you need to plan time for bug fixing, and it comes back to, is this estimate, what is the criteria for those 15 man days for these 3 medium enhancements? You need to be clear on the criteria, and you need to plan time for bug fixing. You need to track the bugs and identify the root causes, especially if it's a long project or you have several phases of your project. You need to identify the root cause so you can take corrective action and increase the quality or the process or whatever it is that is causing these bugs to happen, and be sent out by the development teams. You need to catch those bugs as at the source, and that is the development team. Then you of course need to revise your schedule ongoing. So as you find root causes for bugs, you take steps to corrective actions to improve the process. Your schedule might change, you might need less time for bugs fixing, or you might see that the number of bugs happening is more, so you make sure you revise your schedule ongoingly. so you are in control and you know where you are in the process. And then in red here, be very focused on scope change control. Writing specifications are difficult. It's not an easy task. It doesn't matter if it's a small development, in this case approximately 3 or 5 days of development if we just take the average here, or if it's a long or big development or a big project. Scope change control, you need to be very closely on monitoring and very on top of and monitor very closely, especially for ABAP, and we will tell you how this process should be done. And then one last word of advice here is development is only to start after the specification has been signed off. So you need to agree on the level of detail your specification must contain, and once you have agreed that and the specification has been done, we saw the naming standard, the high level naming standard on the previous slide. Once the specifications are done, you need to get signed off, proper review and sign off before you start the development work. Otherwise you will be into a fight, especially with an external vendor. I've seen this on many occasions, that you persuade the development team to start without the proper signed off specification. It will change, and even though you have scope change control, you're now in a situation where you have no choice than to accept the change, and it might in many cases require rework and delays. So with that good advice, let's look at the controlling part. Let's mention again, and I cannot stress this enough, no specification. If the specification is not signed off, no development. Track progress broken down into sub areas, and you need to be able to track the progress on each step of your development cycle. The technical solution design, meaning the function and the technical team, the coding itself, the testing and the documentation. The development work is not done until the documentation is there. And on the left here we have a table of content for a documentation for development. So make sure that you track every part of the process and do not cut down on testing or documentation. It's just as important, especially if it's a long project with several phases in it, or you need to hand it over to a different support provider. So track each main activity or sub areas. Scope change control, you need to sit on top of this, you need to be on top of it, you need to monitor it. It's very important as any projects including development work. And establish a process and communicate it. Establish a process and communicate it for how to deal with bugs and changes. You might have a scope change control process, but how are you actually in practical life going to do if a bug and a change comes? And what is a bug classification? What is a change classification? Or what is classified as a bug? What is classified as a change? Be very clear on this. And again, if you have external vendors, incorporate the QA into the agreement, just as you incorporate the service levels that they need to adhere to into the vendor agreement, so that they help enforce the box is not accepted culture. So let's have a look at a flowchart here, which I've used with great success on a number of projects. So this assume that the development will change. There will either be developments missed out by the functional teams, and once they start configuring, they find out, oh, I need also this development for my process to work. Or it might be that the development already specified, approved, and is now being requirements documented and started the development process. There is a change to it as you go through the review, or even if you go through the testing. So we have a starting point here, a new ABAP request. So first of all, you need to be clear who's approving it, and if it's not approved, no problem. The process stops there. If it is approved, we need to go through the same steps. Functional specification, output is the program specification. function specification document is, once it's finished, you go into the programmer and develop the program. They create the technical specification, pass it on to the actual programming, and once it is programmed, they test it in their development system. And if there is an error, no, it's very small. If there is an error, if it's impacted on the program specification, you need to go back and you might need a change request to the change. But you need to document it. So you might go through a change request form and you need to change that, and then you can go back and test it again. So this part is basically, you go back up here. So enforce this very strictly. But let's assume that after testing it in the development system, it's okay. You move on now to the functional test. And you then go through the functional test, and if they are okay, functional test okay, you then go and test the development by the user. And once the user has confirmed it, you transfer it to the quality assurance system, and so on. So you see there is some A and B here. So this means that if impact on the program specs, no. Programmer debugs the program error. Okay, they found out what it is. It doesn't need to change. It's a problem in the program itself. So it goes from here, you come back here, they found the solution and they fixed it, and now it is again ready for the functional test. There was no change to the spec. It was simply the programmer who needs to fix a mistake. So as we go through the users, so this is the full cycle. This is from the development to production. Now I know in your project you might want to break this down, and you'll say we do here by the functional, and then this step is UAT, and it's done together for all of the development. But you can use this flowchart for every single development that you have a problem. You can go through this flowchart, and it's a good idea to do. So the end goal is, of course, that we get it into production. So user finds error in production, no changes in production, and then close the there's no errors, there's no change, you close the request. If there is change, you go again and you find, is it approved? Yes. Well, then you go to B, which is here, and you go in and you say, okay, impact on functional spec, just like if it came from this side. If it's not approved, well, you go to the exit point, and you will have to live with the initial request. So this chart, I'll share it with you. Those who want it, please contact me in the forum. It's very helpful, and you can modify it if you have to fit your process or project. But in general, this should be universal and can be applied on every project. You just need to exchange or change the definitions here with your systems, and it might have specific team names and so on, specific names for the change process and so on, but you can use the generic flowchart. Another part of the controlling process is the reporting. So here is an example of an ABAP development progress report, where we have each, as mentioned, each of the different activities: functional specification, technical specification, unit test, functional unit test. This is the technical unit test, functional unit test, and then a remark column. So this is each step, and we will track them based on completeness, and under this, if you unfold these, you will of course have the detail under. Summary issues, this you can make this dashboard in many ways, but you need to have some kind of progress reporting, and I strongly suggest that you have it by the different main activities. So there is material available where you can download a tracking sheet to aid you in this, as well as the documentation for the development. With that, we will summarize this lesson. So after completing this video, you should have a good understanding of how to define the right ABAP development scope and strategy for your project. a lot of good lessons learned, a lot of good considerations that you need to include, and you should also know how you can controlling mechanism that you can use to effectively manage your development team.